to be here. Honestly, this is such an important topic of inflation, because it really resonates to the very center of the engine that drives our economy. And I want to spend a little bit of time with it today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about BLS first, and then I'm going to go into some economics. Won't be too hard. You don't have to take an Advil ahead of time. And then we're going to illustrate how inflation affects, the economy, but we're going to really focus in on one thing that is very seldom focused on, and that's the defense industrial base. And we're, of course, very interested in that today because of the degree to which the NATO countries are supplying arms to Ukraine, and the basic tensions that puts the industrial base under. And then we'll conclude a little bit with what's happening in the region. So if you could go to the next slide, Mike, thank you very much. Let me tell you a little bit about the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We've been around a long time. That is not our current building. That was the building in 1890 when we were brought into, sort of more or less brought into the U.S. government. We started in the Department of Interior, but our founder, Carol Wright, was working in the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the state of Massachusetts before 1884, and made quite a bunch of waves up there. And that's why we were brought into the federal government. We predate the Department of Labor. We are nonpartisan. We do not take any political positions. We do not do any policy work. We are building infrastructure, and you can see some examples of the infrastructure that we build. You can't see the economy. You can't go out and look at the economy. You can't open up your window and look at the economy. The only way the economy can be viewed, because it's real, it's going on, but to view it, you have to view it through classification systems, through statistics, and we provide that infrastructure that allows the economy to become visible. And I think that's just almost an amazing thing. Next slide, please. So this is the Southeast region. We have 6 regions around the country. Glorious Southeast region is really one of our gems, and it serves those states. We'll come back to that in just a little bit, but we go across the entire United States, all the way to Guam, which makes our San Francisco region the largest statistical body in the entire world in terms of just miles. It's hard to do something like this. We're a very diverse country with lots of different sub-economies, but we have been managing it very well, I think, over the past 140 years. Next slide, please. So let's take a look let's think about inflation now. And I want to set this up by first starting with this whole question is, what is a price? It's an elusive concept, but because price is maybe not what you think it is. It is what you think it is, but of course, it's what you see pasted to a product or on a website. What's the price of this pencil? What's the price of that car? But in the much more important sense, it's something that we carry around inside of our heads. When I go out to buy something, I will look at various products. I'll have a sort of a set of needs that I'm carrying around in my head. But I also have a sense, maybe not accurate, but a fairly good sense of what my income is. How much do I have to spend? And then I will have a completely hidden set of priorities. No one knows what's going on. Maybe sometimes I'm not even conscious of it, of what I really prefer now and what I would not prefer. But when I buy something, I am revealing my preferences. I'm revealing something. So price at that point, the price at which I buy something is a signal, a very important signal for anyone who works in the economy of what my preferences are. It's a powerful signal, and it signals what my demand is. So if me and all the rest of the people in the country begin to buy pencils, well, the price of the pencil will probably rise because it will be in short supply relative to the demand. But until we start to buy that, you can't see our preferences. But once we start to buy that, You can see our preferences. And that is such an important thing. It is such a coordinating element to have these preferences revealed. Next slide, please. Likewise, producers also signal through the prices. So a producer is reacting to the demand that suddenly emerges for the product. And so the producer will buy more inputs. They'll buy more coal. They'll buy more tin. They'll buy more fiber optical cable. And so the prices of those goods will begin to rise on the marketplace. Now, if you're a competitor, you know, several hundreds of miles away, for example, there's distance, or you're a competitor in another country, you may not know what the individual producer is doing. You may not know, you may not be, unless you have spy cameras in his accounting office, you may not know what he's buying and how much of it he's buying, but you'll observe that the price of fiber optical cable is rising, or the price of coal is rising, and the price of tin is going down. In which case there's, you know, you could say, well, there's not as much demand for tin. You don't know, you don't really need to know what the individual producer is thinking in order to react efficiently in the marketplace, because all you have to do is see what's happening to prices. Prices are a signal that very efficiently convey information to other competitors, to other players in the market. In fact, you could say, and I think this has been argued in economics for some time, and I think successfully so, that all you really need to know in order to get by as a producer of goods, all you really need to know are the prices and how the prices are moving, because prices convey all the relevant market information necessary for efficient markets to exist. I mean, it's an outrageous statement, but it's basically true. If you think about the world and how limited our knowledge of the world is, we don't know what other people are doing at any one point in time, but we can watch prices move up and down on markets. We can watch prices move up and down in indexes like the CPI. We can go out and collect prices ourselves without knowing anything about the producers. But the price movement itself gives us the necessary information for us to react efficiently in the face of increasing supplies or decreasing supplies, increasing demand or decreasing demand. It's a powerful engine. And this brings us back to inflation. So if you could go to the next slide, Mike. So what's inflation then? I kind of define it a little bit differently than a lot of economists do, so bear with me, may be wrong. So I say that inflation is a special condition of the price system that manifests itself in steadily and rapidly increasing prices month over month and year over year. So you might think, well, inflation is just a constant, right? Prices are generally going up over time. So what's so big deal about the word inflation? Well, what we really mean by inflation is not normal price increase, which is normal price increases are, you know, what are they, 2 to 3% a year? They kind of represent the growing population. You know, the United States has a rapidly growing population, so largely through immigration. So people are pressing their demand for goods and pressing supply, and so prices gradually move up because of population change. But inflation is a special thing. Inflation is abnormally high and sustained increases in prices. So it's not a normal condition in the economy. It's an abnormal condition. We measure it in several different ways. For example, a sister organization, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, produces a wonderful price series. It's called Personal Consumption Expenditures, the price index of that. We produce the classic foundational series. It's called the Consumer Price Index. We also produce the Producer Price Index and 2 Import-Export Price Indexes, in one of each. And we measure price changes by going to 80 different areas in the country. I'll show you a map of that shortly. And we go out with people from like the regional office in Atlanta, and they ask, well, how much are you buying for this or that or this or that? What's the price that you're paying? We do it on a fixed basket of goods so we can compare time. We can compare purchases in one period to purchases in the next period. So when we get all that data together, if you'd go to the next slide, you'll see then how prices have changed. So let's take a moment to kind of tie in what I said about normal price change, signaling, and abnormal price change. This is a graph that basically goes from December of 2016 to December of 2022, just last December. And you can see over the course of the first half of the graph how, as I was arguing, there's a normal sort of growth in prices. We have several indexes on this graph. We have the producer price index, that's kind of the purple line. The CPI, the consumer price index, that's the blue undotted line. You can see it kind of faintly in there in the midst of all the other ones. And then we have the import price index, that's a kind of a yellowish line, and the export price index, which is either red or orange, it's hard to tell. But okay, so all are sort of behaving themselves until about 2020. In August of 2020, see that big dip down April 2020, April 2020. And then the import-export prices begin to rise, the PPI begins to rise, and the CPI begins to rise. And you can see how abnormal the period after that has been relative to what I would say normal price changes before. If you could go to the next slide. In addition to these national indexes, we produce special indexes. Well, they're special, they're derivative indexes on government purchases. So we have government purchases for defense, we have government purchases for non-defense. So here's an example of, well, you know what defense expenditures are, military aircraft, but also engineering services, navigation and guidance systems, machinery, equipment, and so forth and so on. A lot of things go into the purchase indexes for defense. Non-defense would be school buildings, portfolio management, commercial power, diesel fuel, and so forth and so on. Next slide, please. And as you can see from this slide, we have almost exactly the same signature in government purchases for defense and non-defense as we had for the civilian side. You can see the normal price growth in the first half of the graph, and then kind of the last 40% of this graph, because it has slightly different time periods. The last 40% is that abnormal period, and it's remarkable how similar the abnormality is, the portrait of the abnormality, to the civilian overall side. Next slide, please. So how do we measure price change? BLS is kind of the definitive price change king here. We've been measuring this price change, the CPI, since the beginning of the 20th century. Back then, my predecessors, the commissioners of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, were charged by the president to settle strikes, settle labor disturbances. And so we would go in and we largely through talking, well, looking at my predecessors, I know they weren't big muscular guys, so they didn't go in and, physically change it, but they would go in and negotiate a settlement. And so part of what they had to do to negotiate that settlement is to say, okay, here's your escalator clause. Here's the clause in your settlement that gives you next year's wage increase and next year's wage increase. And in order to do it fairly, we had to tie it to something. So we tied it to a bundle of goods, consumption expenditures. Well, we're much more modern now in how we do that. And we develop basically a basket of goods. It's got hundreds of goods in it. And we follow those goods for both businesses and households, a little bit different on businesses, but certainly for households, over a long period of time before we change the composition of the basket. So we don't do that very often. We change what are called the sampling weights every year, every other year. We'll be going forward every year now, which is a big improvement. And we get out of this when we collect all the prices and the prices from the regional areas, and they go up here to the national office, we get the price index. So this is called a fixed weight index of goods over time. If you want to know the technical term, it's called a Lesper's index. If you could go to the next slide, and here's an example of two things that I consume a lot about, milk and gasoline. For me, milk is not a necessity, all right, like gasoline is, but for some it would be. So the blue line on here shows milk, and this graph goes from about January of 2007 to the late fall of 2022. And you can see then the gasoline price, and you can see how really different the two goods are. One, milk, is fairly stable, it fluctuates, floats around, has a very distinct trend, and gasoline is just all over the place, just with a lot of variation in it. So next slide, please. In order to understand how we create our measures of inflation, and we get to the whole the CPI, let's talk a little bit about the regions. I'll go back now to where I started, showing you the Southeast region. Victoria Lee is our new regional commissioner. She's great. Hope you get a chance to meet her. So next slide, please. The Bureau's regional offices, Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Dallas, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and of course Atlanta, have three primary tasks. They collect economic data from businesses, including a variety of prices, which feed into both the national and local statistics. They collect a lot of data on compensation. They're doing some wonderful work on that in that area, and you get some great information about wages and benefits from the work that the regional data collectors do. And they collect the CPI. And then they coordinate with the states for economic information, for employment information. They work a lot with the states on the UI systems, the unemployment insurance systems, and they provide a ton of information to the general public. And I hope you go to the web page for the Atlanta region. You'll find great information about business activity in your area. So please do that. Now that you're wondering, what in the heck are those little green dots? Well, the green dots are the sampling areas for our CPI. We don't sample in every county. We can't afford to do that. So what we do is we try to find some urban areas where we have representativeness for the whole population in terms of a lot of characteristics and a lot of consumption activity, consumption profiles, and we take just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of samples from those green areas. Those are called the principal statistical areas, and that's where we're getting all of our stuff. Next slide, please. The Atlanta region collects prices from 8 states, and our staff interact with businesses in Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida to learn about what's happening currently. To the degree that there are regional trends in our items, such as intense demand for electricity in the southern summer, and I'm sure that that's a big item, we would see this emerging at the local level first. Next slide, please. The regional office also coordinates with state agencies to collect certain data. This is a very important relationship, what we call our Fed state programs, very important. Many of our surveys on employment, for example, are collected in partnership with the states, allowing BLS to produce really consistent national, state, and local data. And we're working very, very hard right now to really improve our interactions with the states through what's called the Labor Market Information Network, LMI. If you get into this and you want to know more about what your state is doing to identify trends in the economy and in the workforce, look up the local Labor Market Information Office there. They're great people. Next slide, please. The regional offices also produce a lot of things for the general public. They are constantly answering questions. They are sending out material through email, through faxes, through old snail mail. And as I mentioned, they produce a lot of material which is posted, hundreds of documents a year, which are posted on our website. All right, so that's what's happening at the regional level. I promised I would take a little bit of a deeper dive to go in, and if you would go to the next slide, let's take a look at what's happening to our defense industrial base because of inflation. And we do in fact see this. And so let's tie this down. It matters to the state of Georgia. You have a lot of defense expenditures down there, and so this is a relevant topic. We just, as you can see on the slide, in 2021, the Department of Defense spent $15 billion in Georgia, which is 2.1% of the state's gross domestic product. Next slide, please. When we think about the defense industrial base, this may be a new term for you, but it's an old term in defense economics. What we're really doing is we're talking about some components that interact with each other. The first kind of leg of the stool are the defense strategy plans, the national readiness plans, the nuclear posture plan. And these are wonderful plans, maybe not wonderful because we're talking about defense, but important plans that you can get on the Department of Defense website, take a look at and see, what's the planning horizon. That's the first leg. The second leg is all the work that Congress does every year through the National Defense Authorization Act and through appropriations. So that's the budget leg. And the final one, the one that most people think about when they say the industrial base, is the private production of defense goods and services. I also sometimes add a fourth leg, which is the feedback loop. I won't be talking about that, but it's important that there is a feedback loop back to all three of these other legs of the stool. But we'll only be talking about the consequences for the first three. So let's go to the next slide. So let's take a look at the federal budget piece. So each year, the Armed Services Committees of the House and the Senate put together a plan for the year and a plan for usually five years, that year plus 4 more, which is called the National Defense Authorization Act. And it's an authorization act, means it authorizes activity but doesn't fund activity. So especially with respect to the multi-year planning, which is so important in developing new aircraft carriers like the Ford series of our big aircraft carriers, or the F-35, or the multi-year programs that are so central and common in the defense industry. They need to have some level of predictability. Well, inflation gets in there and just mucks it all up. If you're planning on, say, normal price growth of this particular product line, say, I don't know, an aircraft carrier of 6% per year, and the inputs that are the steel and all the other, and the labor force, all begin to cost more than that, then what happens is there's great uncertainty in the planning field. And one of the casualties are lower level priority projects. These are frequently sacrificed in order to fund the higher priority projects. But the lower priority projects may be something like building a new ammunition plant. And my gosh, we need that now, right? It's more than ever. So inflation can be very upsetting to the planning. It could even upset the manpower planning. That is, what are we going to do for getting people to join the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and so forth, the Air Force? Because with rising inflation, perhaps the pay structure of our armed services is inadequate now, and recruitment becomes very difficult. The next slide, please. Inflation also upsets strategic planning. Plans are clearly multi-year. They're looking way into the future, and they're assuming a certain profile of our adversaries and our allies, oftentimes an economic profile. What's the capacity of China to build certain kinds of equipment? Well, that is tied not only to their technical characteristics and their resources, but also to how much they're going to have to pay for inputs, to pay either locally or pay internationally. Certainly true for countries that are smaller than China, but more dangerous than China, North Korea, Iran, Russia comes to mind. So when inflation comes in, we get uncertainty in the planning area. We don't know how much our adversaries are going to be able to do what we're sort of thinking they could do. And so uncertainty produces great difficulties for military planning, as you can imagine. There's enough uncertainty anyway in this, but the distortion of economic signals that inflation does is it makes it, well, in a sense, inflation becomes then a threat to the country, because our planning is the way we defend the country. Next slide, please. But all of these problems are just manifestly greater at the level of the production of goods and services. So let me talk a little bit about that. What we're talking about when I say production of goods and services is not the production of the entire economy. In the defense industrial base, there are firms that specialize in the production of pieces that the Defense Department needs to buy. Boeing comes to mind, right? Boeing is partially a civilian operation, and it has enormous defense wings, producing a lot of equipment, not only airplanes, airframes, but also services that are consumed by the Department of Defense and the various branches of the military. Well, these private firms are different than government, right? They have to produce a profit from year to year. That's the way a private firm stays in business. Even if you're a defense contractor, that's the way it is. And so when you think about the challenges of inflation, the first one that comes to mind, the first element is whether or not in an inflationary period, a defense contractor working on multi-year contracts can make the necessary required rate of return to keep his or her stockholders happy. Has to be a profit in there. And inflation can produce not only great uncertainty, but it can produce lower profits. Let's step back just a moment from that and talk about the uncertainty element. One of the things that defense contractors have to face in the uncertainty category, besides inflation, is the uncertainty that comes from the budget that feeds these contractors. The federal government is struggling, and has been for some time, with large deficits. And so in 2011, again in 2013, it had government shutdowns. The government shutdowns stopped the flow of money going out into the contracting community and produced a serious disruption in the cash flow of the firms that needed to have a profit in order to do the contracts. Also, the Defense Reduction Act of 2011 promised defense reductions, outlay reductions, on a scheduled basis for a 10-year period. Now, we've abandoned that, but at the time, it was a really good instance of where the budget just chased contractors out of the market. They said, well, we're not going to have any of that. We've got to have much more predictability if we're going to stay in, if we're going to stay there and continue to provide these kinds of services. Congress just passed an authorization which, if it's fully appropriated, is $828 billion for the Defense Department. But whether or not that is going to attract contractors in is largely not a matter of the $828 billion. It's whether they see more certainty and more profits by being a contractor of the federal government. Next slide, please. So let's just continue on this front, and let's have what I've just said about uncertainty that's inherent in inflation interact a little bit with the policy response that the Federal Reserve produces. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate to maintain maximum employment and stable prices. And so this mandate they execute in various ways. When they're faced with inflation, they try to bring in the unstable prices, the rapidly increasing unstable prices, down to some level of stability, which they define as annual growth of 2 to 3% per year. And they do so, as is well known, by raising interest rates. The interest rate is supposed to reduce the demand for goods and services, reduce the kind of the pressures on the economy that are causing prices to rise, and prices begin to fall. They also try to do that without producing a recession. But increasing interest rates inhibits the ability of a defense contractor to make the necessary rate of return or profit to stay in the business of producing goods and services for the Defense Department. It produces additional uncertainty, and it has a definite effect in the number of firms that are present to produce these goods and services. If you go to the next slide, please. Up, back one. I'm not quite ready for that. So let's just say one more thing about consolidation before we leave this. In 1990, there were 55 major defense contractors. Today, there are 5. Now, as Secretary Austin said this morning at NATO headquarters in a speech that I hope you are able to hear, his major concern now is the capacity of the United States and other countries, which have also gone under very similar patterns of losing defense contractors, the ability of contractors to not only supply Ukraine with the goods and services that they need, but to rebuild the munitions and the tanks and the howitzers and all those things, so that our own country and the other NATO countries will have a stronger defensive posture. We've had massive consolidation, and it's the result of a lot of things that have gone wrong in budgeting and in planning. But inflation is threatening even further consolidation. And if inflation causes this consolidation, if for example, Northrop Grumman or Boeing decides we're through, we're not doing any more work for the federal government, and we're closing down our defense plants, then that's could be possible. Or if one firm buys another and we go from 5 to 4, are we going to have the ability to efficiently defend the United States in a multi-theater world, which we're fighting basically, sea battles in Asia and land battles in Europe? So what I've done today, if you could go to the next slide, is I've just given you a taste of the situation we're in. There are lots of aspects here to the inflation story. It affects households differently than it affects the industrial base. We could discuss that for hours. But I think it's very interesting to go to this sort of unseen area, which is the defense of the country and its interaction with inflation. Will inflation come down? Yes, of course. Every period of inflation has seen a subsidence at some point. But the problem is, how long does the abnormal price increase period last? Because the longer it lasts, the more corrosive its influence is on all aspects of our economy. It is more important to tamp down inflation than almost any other economic aberration that we face, because it goes to so many aspects of life. Next slide, please. Before I leave, I do want to, because I'm hopeful that there are people on here who maybe ask someday to provide data to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I hope that you will do that. It's so important that we have your voluntary participation. We almost all of our data comes from people like yourselves opening up your businesses or your households to the data collector from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and saying, yes, I'd like to help you. Here's my data. We protect your data like the government protects gold at Fort Knox. Nobody's going to get to it. It's totally safe. Also, we would ask you to visit our website, visit us on Twitter, give us feedback, just participate with us as much as you possibly can. Mike, next slide, please. It's just been a great, well, I didn't know I was going to be able to get in, but now that I have, I've really enjoyed talking, and I'm more than happy to answer any question that you folks have.
So, obviously, Commissioner Beach, a lot of information there.
Yeah,
as far as
too much.
yeah, as far as participants, the Q&A is open. Please let us know what some of your questions are. I'll take a couple right off the top. Kind of one of the biggest that certainly relates to both CPI, but also the main jobs report, which you mentioned is seasonal adjustments. And I know that there's a ton of confusion out there. And of course, the BLS provides not just the seasonally adjusted, but also the unadjusted, whether people ignore it or not. All the information is provided. So back to your point of there's a lot of data out there. And as a user of that data, I very much appreciate it. But help frame this the right way so that people understand kind of the why and the how on the seasonal adjustments, not just for CPI, but also PPI, and like, why in the world do we do this?
Indeed. Well, we have in the economy, we have periods of activity and inactivity. For example, the classic case is the hiring for people who work at Christmas time, and then the unhiring of the Christmas workers. So beginning in October, we see hiring go up in retail, warehousing, transportation, temporary work, a lot of industries that are connected to the buying season, which culminates in Christmas. You know, millions of people sometimes. And then in January and February, those people leave the rolls. So for example, in this January, we had the not seasonally adjusted number of jobs was a minus 2,500,000. And if you only looked at the not seasonally adjusted, you'd say the economy has gone to hell in a handbasket. The bottoms dropped out. And we reported a positive growth, seasonally adjusted growth of 514,000. So people say, what is going on here? Well, the seasonal adjustment is, I think the best way to think about it, it's the trend line. It's the line that goes through, it's the trend over time that goes through all the seasonal variations that are happening. Every June, we have a big increase in employment from teenagers. Well, if we didn't seasonally adjust that, you would think the economy's booming in June and busting in September. And it would look that way. So both numbers are important. No question about it. I had a fellow call me up and he said, "Oh, your number's false, because the 2,500,000 number is the real number. That's how much is going on here." And he was a partisan for I think the Republican side. I'm going to guess he was. So I pointed out to him that between 2017 and 2018, December to January, when President Trump was in office, the not seasonally adjusted number was a decrease of 3,700,000. And the seasonal adjusted number was 143,000 positive. That was the trend. So we didn't hear a whole lot after that. I think that's the way to think about seasonal adjustment. Don't look at each month, but look at the trend that it shows you. And it adjusts out all of these variations that come from predictable increases or decreases in some activity.
Great. That helps, get a little better understanding. There's a couple of questions right away that popped in there.
Sure.
So it's a 3-year or a 5-year rolling when that seasonal adjustment gets rejiggered every couple of years?
Well, we take a look at it pretty much all the time. We don't like to change it very frequently, right. But for example, we made a lot of adjustments in 2021 to the mathematics, to the formulas that we use to do the seasonal adjustment. Why did we do that? Well, because 2020 was a weird year. I mean, I know people want to forget about 2020. I do, for sure. But just take one example. In February, I announced a 3.5%, February of 2020, I announced a 3.5% unemployment rate. 2 months later, the unemployment rate that we're announcing is nearly 16%. Okay, 20 million jobs were lost in the month of April alone. That's the largest job loss in U.S. history. As far as we know, it's larger than what happened in 1930 or 1933 or any of those the 30s period. Um, well, if we use the historical data from the 20s in our model of doing seasonal adjustments in our math, it's going to be weird, right? It's going to be have a big aberrant effect. So we changed the way we do seasonal adjustments a little bit by recognizing the fact that there are changes in levels and changes in trends, changes in magnitudes that can come from big variations in historical numbers. You can read all about this on our website. So that year, with next year, we just changed the way our model worked. We also changed a couple of other models that are used to account for, say, new business creation. And we made a lot, and I think going forward, anytime we have a big crisis, we're going to go into our seasonal models and try to fix them right away. Now, even fixing them still preserved real good continuity over the history period. So it wasn't, you won't see a big jump and a big variations from that. I'd like our team to be constantly looking at seasonal factors, and maybe every other year we come in and we make publicly announced changes if that's required. Clearly, every 3 or 4 years, we need to really seriously scrape to see whether we need to make some big changes. I must say, Mike, before I go on, all of the data that's coming out for January, this would be the CPI that came out yesterday, tomorrow's PPI, our employment number, which came out Friday last, includes a lot of changes that are coming from, for example, the new classification system. The North American Industrial Classification System went from 2017 version to a 2022 version. Big changes to the definitions of certain industries. We had big changes there. We also, on the price side, the North American product indexes, those changed a lot. A lot of stuff you guys probably don't want to know about, but there are just a ton of changes that went on in the January numbers. So people who really want to focus on January itself need to become PhDs in all those changes that we made.
And there really is some tension there, because on one side, there's a group of people saying, why aren't these things being updated? Yeah. Obviously, we're not still in the same period, like, again, that 2017 to 2022 jump. And then the other side, like, oh, well, they just changed the numbers, or they changed the methodology. Okay, yeah. So which one is it?
Yeah.
You want us to update, or you don't? So I definitely sense that. But there's a couple questions. So one is specific to seasonal adjustments. Does BLS still use X11 program? I'm not familiar with it, but
we use the sons and daughters of X11. So this is X11 with the various changes that we've made. That is a way to take a look at a time series, which of course we're looking at month after month, 1 month after month. That's a time series, and to notice the changes over time, up and down, and to find the seasonal variations in those changes. Not all ups and downs are seasonal. For example, the pandemic was a definite down and then a big up, but that was not a seasonal factor. Nothing seasonal about that at all. If we were to go to war and all of a sudden we're on a war footing and half of the population between the ages of 17 and 30 go into the military, that would not be a seasonal variation. So we have to separate those kinds of things from what is really seasonal, and X11 helps us do that. It helps us to do the mathematics of time series analysis.
Yeah, you mentioned also the annual changes in the sampling weights in the CPI basket.
Yeah.
Kind of pull back the curtain a little bit, Lonnie. What drove that? What made that possible? Was it better data? Was it other factors? Was it computing power?
Yeah. Okay. So what we do when we go out and measure the CPI change is we take a basket of goods and we, from month to month, just look at that basket of goods. Well, how do we know that that's the right basket? Well, we go back to what's called the sampling frame, the foundation, the source. And the source is another survey called the Consumption Expenditure Survey. We go to households, go thousands of households, and we sit down with them at my kitchen table, and we go through all their receipts, and we go through an interview. And we say, well, how much did you pay this month for this? And how much did you pay for this? And we see what kinds of things they're buying. That survey is done just basically once a year with an update in the middle of the year. What we're going to do now is we're going to annually go back to that survey and see whether or not the things in our CPI basket are still being purchased by the household at the levels that we think they are. If the levels have changed, that means the weights in our basket will change. And by doing annual weights, we'll be much more accurately reflecting changes in household consumption and preferences than we were when we were doing it every 10 years, every 5 years, and every 2 years. It used to be we did it every 10 years. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and we also had, oh, sorry to cut you off there. We also had a pretty dramatic shift in that basket insofar as the post-pandemic period, the shift to goods versus services. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, obviously this, like you're mentioning, an annual true up, a reconfiguration definitely is more appropriate, like you say, than rather than something longer. But does that, what sort of variation is that going to give us going forward? And obviously we're likely to stay on a little bit more of a goods versus services shift. Yeah. We're still there, you know, and talk a little bit about that. Maybe your own personal feeling as to, is that going to last, or, you know, where do we go from there?
Right. Well, we're a pretty conservative organization, small c conservative. Pardon me. We don't make changes quickly or happily. So when we go back to look at sampling weights, we probably will say, well, was that just a weird 1 year thing? You know, I didn't do much eating in restaurants in 2020, and yet that's a component in the consumption expenditures bundle. Pardon me. So we'll be very conservative on that, Mike, and won't be making big changes. However, we will, and we have seen people moving from food at home to food away from home. And that's changing. And we will definitely be picking that up in our annual weights and other things like that.
Yeah. Well, so, and the food pieces have been shifting dramatically. Certainly egg prices in recent months, back half of 2022 and into 2023.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And now we're finally starting to see that subside. But, you know, does the timing of that annual benchmarking of the weights, that's going to have some impact there too as well? What's the view on that? Because obviously you have to pick some point in time, but how does that figure in?
So we have to be really careful when we do the weights that we're not taking a momentary aberration and building it in for a year. You know, gasoline prices is a perfect example, right? Because gasoline prices, as you probably remember from my graphic, go all over the places. But gasoline, when it goes up, tends to crowd out a lot of retail buying, or crowds out some other things. It's a necessity. So we have to be very careful in terms of weighting these other things in the presence of high gasoline prices. If it persists for year after year after year, I suspect the weights will begin to change for the non-gasoline items, because the household will have really recomposed its permanent bundle. But, you know, temporary changes we have to kind of ignore in order to get to a continuity of household consumption. You probably know about the permanent income hypothesis, which is a long lifetime thing. Well, we have a kind of small variation of that, that household consumption patterns don't change that much year to year, but they do change a little bit, and we have to take that into account. Pardon me.
So here's one. You shared your perspective on the demand side of inflation. Since COVID, we have seen supply issues obviously affecting inflation in a big way, including the computer chips, silicon chips, and we have trade agreements and all that sort of thing. But we've also gotten some of our friends, if you will, Japan, the Dutch. It sounds like the UK is going to come on board as well. Is that going to be a defense issue on some of those inflation factors that you mentioned as far as the defense industrial base?
Well, I think it may. As you may know, the United Kingdom is a major player in NATO. They are a major player in the Ukraine war, and they are an essential partner in a bilateral relationship, which we have. But the rate of inflation in the United Kingdom is still in excess of 10%. They're having a very hard time bringing it down. And news this morning, you might have seen it. The defense minister is already beginning to caution people on the likely success of the defense authorization bill going through Parliament at this point in time. He wants to raise the defense expenditures by 10 billion pounds, and he doesn't think he can do so. And why? Because of the pressures being placed upon the budget from inflation in the areas of healthcare and housing. So there, inflation is directly affecting the capacity of Britain to be as big a partner as it has been.
Yeah, particularly since most of it's imported, right? I mean, most of it's coming from the U.S., among others. I tell you, we could obviously go for hours. We've reached the top of the hour here, so we're going to wrap it up. I learned a whole bunch, but I would tell you, one of the frequent things that I get asked when I'm out speaking and whatever, not just CPI, but also the jobs and, you know, inflation data generally, is that, well, why is the price data in BLS? And you answered that with the genesis of it was because of labor pricing and wage escalation. I was amazed, but it certainly makes sense now that you mention it. Like, oh, well, that's why it, housed within BLS rather than in BEA or somewhere else. That the genesis was within the context of labor. So,
yeah,
great discussion.
That's the explanation, and it is very expensive to go out and get original data through interviews. We're very good at it. We're very efficient with the public's money. Let me just conclude with one thing. We have touched on a number of technical topics. We post information on all these technical topics on our website, and anytime anybody has trouble finding them, call the regional office, call the national office, start with the regional office, and we'll send you the link. Like on changes to the NAICS codes, changes to seasonal factors. It's all there. It should be transparent. If it's not, I'll find you an expert to explain it to you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Beach. Very much appreciate your time. Everyone, thanks for joining us. March 15th, in person, as Ibrahim mentioned, we're going to be on the Cox campus. Julia Coronado talking about the U.S. economic outlook. So please join us. We'll send you some emails. We're also going to post things on the website. So again, thanks for joining us today. And thank you again, Commissioner Beach.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.